in a given period of time. So, and also we are looking at the rate, at the speed at which it moves. Now, so it is a technique that is used to measure airflow in and out of the lungs. Now, what I want you to keep in mind, you cannot measure the amount of air in your lungs. You can only measure the one you blow out. So if this is your face there, and you have your mouth there, whatever you blow out is what can be captured by a spirometer. So if you blow out so much volume, that is expiratory volume because you have taken it out. If you assume this part is airtight, so if it is airtight, it does not allow any leakage of air between the balloon and the mouth. It means when you inhale, whatever volume you take in will reduce this balloon by that volume. So now your inhalation volume can be captured by looking at the difference between when you blew the air out and when you inhaled. So this is your inspiratory volume. So if you are breathing in, if you have a normal slow breathing, and assuming that the air is not contaminated, so it is just the same air you're breathing in and out is good enough. It means, by the way, my co-hosts, you can allow your classmates to come in so that I don't keep on stopping the video too. That is Samuel and Nicholas. Make sure that you know the person who is coming in so that I don't have to stop my lecture. So when you blow in and out, it means that the volume of air will be fluctuating between this volume and that volume, and this will be the tidal volume. So as you inhale, exhale, that volume is what you'll be calling a normal, slow, or tidal volume. Then if you are to blow it further, say for example, use more force, it means the balloon will become larger. And if you are to make sure that you inhale as much air as you can, it means that the air outside here will be small. The balloon will be small. So the only thing that you can be able to measure is the air that leaves your mouth and the air that gets into your mouth, but you cannot measure what is in the lungs. For that reason, when you look at spirometry, you will have a mouthpiece, and that mouthpiece will be capturing all the air that you are breathing out, and that volume will be measured. It will be quantified. And then when you are given instructions to inhale, the same spirometer will measure how much volume you have taken in. So spirometry, as we say, it is a very simple and safe test to measure the lung volumes, and they are represented in a graphical display. That means whatever we'll get, we are going to capture it in form of a graph. Secondly, after you know how much volume of air that comes in and goes out, there are two components that you can measure. You can look at the amount of air regardless of how much time you take to move in the air. What does that mean? Right now, if I told you to just take in a breath, take in so much air as much as you can. Some people may decide to gasp up the air at a very fast rate. Others may decide to just slowly inhale the air. At the end of the day, the amount of air that you will be occupied in your lungs, so if these are your lungs, and the person who took in the air slowly and the person who took in the air fast, it doesn't matter. The maximum volume that will be occupied in the lungs will be the same. So the rate in this case does not matter. When you're just simply taking care of volumes of air, regardless of how much time it takes to move that air, then in that case, you talk of static recording. because it is not time. It is not taking into account how long you take to move the air. However, when we start looking at how much time do you take to move that air from outside to inside, so I can tell you to forcefully exhale, remove the air in your lungs as fast as you can. Then in that case, we are taking into account the time taken to remove that amount of air. Then in that case, we'll be doing a dynamic recording. So that's the difference between dynamic and static. So what is the purpose of measuring the volumes of air or even the rates at which you move in the air? Now, if you remember, anything that is passing through a cylinder, it takes into consideration the resistance within that cylinder, and the amount, the volume will be determined by the resistance that is provided. Now, within your airways, we have a given diameter within the trachea, within the bronchioles, and all the way to the tiny, tiny airways. In case of anything, you have inflammation or you have congestion, you have mucus, and this lines the walls of the airways, you find that the volume, the space within which the air moves becomes limited. Now, if it becomes limited, then it will have an impact on the volume of air that can be able to pass there. For that reason, you can be able to use spirometry to determine if you have this type of congestion. Do you have any resistance within your airways? So that if I tell you to inhale, you find you'll have a problem with allowing air to move in because of the restriction of the airways. That, therefore, you can compare a healthy individual who is able to breathe in without any resistance and the one who is unable to breathe in by looking at the volume of air. For that reason, you can use spirometry to actually access or determine the lung function of that particular individual. This problem does not only affect the airways, because even the lung expansion, remember I told you in class, you may be able to blow up a small balloon, which is very compliant. That means it can easily stretch and it becomes a very big balloon. In the same breath, you may have a small balloon, but because the material is very tight, no matter how much you try to blow it up, you can only allow a small amount of air. For that reason, even a person who is not able to expand their lungs, you can also determine by using spirometry whether they have a problem with expansion. So when you have this type of condition where the problem is expansion of the chest or expansion of the lungs, then you say, then this person is restricted in breathing because the amount of air that they can take is really restricted by the expansion of that lung. So in that kind of pulmonary disease, we say that you have a restrictive pulmonary disease. And you'll find that in some of the cases, like when I told you in class, you may have a problem with compliance because you do not have surfactant. You may have a problem with elasticity so that the lungs are not able to expand very easily. You may have a problem with the chest wall. The muscles are not able to expand. So all those are restrictive conditions. On the other hand, when it is the airways that are congested, then we have an obstructive disease because it is the airways that are obstructed and they are not allowing air to move. So when we talk like in the video that I was showing you, and I'm sorry that I had not managed to upload those videos because I had a problem with internet yesterday, but I'll do it right away. So in the video that I was showing you, they were talking about a smoker's cough and a smoker's obstruction, because what happens is the airways are lined with soot. And because of that, they limit the passage through which the air can pass. For that reason, a person with such a condition has an obstructive pulmonary disease. Now, if you look at the graph of the spirometer of a restrictive condition and you compare it to an obstructive condition, you find that it is very different, and we are going to see the differences. For that reason, number 4, spirometry is used to allow for diagnosis of airflow obstruction, so that if somebody has asthma, with asthma, we usually have inflammation of the airways, and those inflamed airways, they restrict passage of air. But you find that upon giving some inhalers, that they usually have some bronchodilations where the airways dilate, and you can be able to monitor a person with asthma whether they are actually responding to the treatment you are giving them by using spirometry. So you can check for COPD. COPD is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. As a typical example is like somebody with a long history of smoking, or you can have a problem with obstruction in the case of asthma. But together with number 4, it is also a good diagnosis for a restrictive disease. Any questions so far for those people who came late? Okay. So I will avail these slides and you'll see why we do spirometry. I've highlighted the functions for spirometry. In red, 1 is to measure airflow obstruction. Number 2 is to detect if there is airway of that obstruction. And number 3, to check the response to treatment, so that if there was that obstruction, you've captured it. Then you give treatment. Then you do spirometry again and see whether the person is responding to treatment. Now, in some cases, you find that before you are allowed to go for operation or something, surgery, they have to do some spirometry so that they can check whether you are in a fit condition to be allowed to go for that. So it is used as a pre-operative assessment test. Then you can also use spirometry to distinguish between obstructive disease and restrictive disease, just like I mentioned in the previous slide. Then you find there are some people or some employers who require you to do this spirometry before they can employ you, so that they can check your fitness. So they do not want you to go in a place where they have a problem with air. Maybe you are raising in places where there is very low air pressure, and therefore you start having problems with breathing. So they can do a screening before employment. Now, at this juncture, I really wanted to show you a video of how you used to do spirometry some time back using a Bell spirometer. We used to call it the Benedict Roth spirometer. But I'm wondering, I'm debating whether I should do that because we've run short of time. If we have time, I'll show you the video at the end of the slides. But the setup is as shown in this slide. So it is not very clear on this picture, but there is a string that is passing from this container here, and it's going up to the pulley, and then from there it goes this way, and from there it goes down, and it is held at this point. So what happens is that at this juncture here. This is the point where you are going to insert the tube that is coming from your mouthpiece. Now, there are two containers. One outside container having a lot of water, and the other one is an empty drum which is turned upside down, so that inside the drum, you trap some air. Now, in this inlet comes and releases into this container, so that whatever you breathe in is coming from this container, and when you breathe out, it goes into this internal container. So what will happen is when you breathe out, because you are pushing air in that direction, the air will move into that container, the middle container, and it will cause this bell jar to rise. When it rises, the string here will lower on this side because we have a weight here. On this side, there is a weight pulling it down. So when you breathe out, you fill in the container, push up the bell jar, and you pull down the string on this side. Now, what you have attached to this is a transducer, and then there is a pen. And this pen has some ink within which it writes on this paper. Now, this paper, if it is stagnant, it is not moving. It means that every time you move the pen up, if you move it down, it will go down. If you move it up, it will go up. If you move it down, so it will be at the same position going up and down. Now, to avoid that, what happens is, this is a kymograph. We call it a rotating drum, and the whole of this is the kymograph. So what you do is you set a speed at which you are going to rotate this drum. So as you rotate it, so you are rotating it in this angle. As the drum rotates and the pen is moving, you find that now, instead of having the up-down movement, you will be having a graph that is being drawn, depending on the speed at which you are rotating the drum. So, because this paper is calibrated so that, and you have set the time here, so that it is moving a given number of boxes per given time, you can be able to calculate the time it takes to move from one point to the other. And when you calculate the time, and you also know the volume, you can also be able to relate volume against time. Now, to make it easier, I'll bring you to this. This is the same setup. So we have our spirometer here. This is the bell that is turned upside down, and it has a string that is attached to a pulley, and the pulley is attached to a pen, and the pen is writing on this calibrated paper, which is actually tied around a rotating drum. So as you keep on breathing, you can see the mouthpiece has an inlet into the middle container. And as you breathe in, it pulls when you breathe in, it pulls the container, the bell down, and you find that the pen goes up. When you exhale, the bell goes up and the pen goes down. And then you can actually see this is the kind of graph that you are getting. Are we clear on that part?
Yes.
Anybody with a question on that particular setup? So it is very easy to look at this physically and relate it to the graphs that you're getting. However, when you go to the lab next week, this is not the setup you'll be having. The reason I usually introduce my spirometry with this setup is because you can relate the inhaling and exhaling to the graph that you get here. Once you're able to relate that, I will take you to the modern spirometers, which instead of using this movement of a bell up and down, it uses something called a pneumotachometer. Now, what this does, it is a handheld device. You can see this lady holding it here. It has a mouthpiece on one side, and by the way, this should be disposable mouthpiece so that you're not going to share the mouthpieces. When one person uses, you cannot use it with a second person unless they are sterilized, but we advocate for disposable ones. So once you place the mouthpiece in your mouth, the other thing you have to do is to ensure that your nose is clipped. That way, you are sure that all the air that you're breathing in and out is being captured through the tachometer. Now, this handheld device, what it does is as you breathe in, it will pass through this region here. The air will flow from the mouth to the other side here. So actually, if you look at the direction, air is going to move through here, and it will be going out. And when you breathe in, the air moves in the opposite direction, in this direction, back to the mouth. So how do you measure volume? Since you are not capturing the air, how are you going to use this device to measure volume? So now what you normally do, if you look at volume and flow, the flow of anything, if you are going to measure the flow, if you have a cylinder here and you want to check the rate of flow of whether it is water or whether it is air, how much volume is passing through here in a given time. So what you can do is, using a time component, allow air to move and capture. Say, for example, for 1 second, how much air has moved. So you have the component of flow, which is usually volume per given time. So if you have volume displaced or moved per given time, and this will describe flow. Okay. Therefore, you can use the rate of flow to determine volume by taking this time component and multiplying it by so now you can have time component, multiply it by flow, and you're going to get your volume. So this is how the tachometer or the handheld device is able to capture the volume, because it looks at the rate at which air is moving through this device. Within this device, there is some transducers which are able to capture the volume of air that has passed through them in a given period of time. Once they're able to capture that volume, by using the same, using this formula here, they can tell how much volume. Now, once you capture the volume, the information is transferred from the spirometer, because the spirometer is here, it will be transferred to a computer. And the computer is going to capture the volume in one direction, so that if you're blowing out, the volume of air will go in one direction. So say, for example, you are blowing it out, it goes up. Then when you are told inhale, the air will move in the opposite direction. So in this case, if you are told to blow out, it goes in that direction. If you are told to inhale, it goes in this direction. So it will keep on alternating between one direction and the other. That way, the graph here will be able to be captured by going in one direction and capturing the amount of air that passes. Going in the opposite direction and the amount of air that passes. And that way you can use this handheld device, you can use the spirometer, and you are going to get that kind of graph, similar to what you are getting in the spirometry with the kymograph. So in our case, I think before you people came, we had a small spirometer that we were using. But in this case, for your lab next week, this device is being replaced by the power lab. So we will use the power lab and the accessories so that you have the handheld tachometer, the power lab, which is connected to a computer. And by doing those breathing exercises, you'll be able to capture. Of course, we have the software which gives you the instructions. So once you have the background information of how you capture the graphs, the next thing you need to understand are the lung volumes. You need to know each volume of air you breathe out, what does it represent? So now we go to the lung volumes. So far, remember, we are capturing the air that is moving or getting out of your mouth. So if these are your lips, and this is the tachometer here, the handheld device, the amount of air that goes in and goes out is what we'll be measuring. So when you inspire, when you breathe in, what will happen is air will move in one direction. It will go in this direction. And when it goes in this direction, you're going to have a volume change in the air that is outside. So let's say you have here. Okay. So now the air has moved from this volume to this volume. There is that volume change. When you breathe in, that's what happens. When you breathe out, the opposite happens. So now you are breathing out, the air is pushing this component and the balloon goes back to where it was here. Okay. So now you'll be fluctuating between breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out. You are not using force, you are at rest, and therefore this volume is called quiet breathing. When you have quiet breathing, the amount of air going in and out is roughly about 500 mLs. Roughly about 500 mLs. So now you breathe in 500, you breathe out 500. Now, if I were to ask you to take a deep breath, as much air as you can, take in as much as you can, what will happen is that now this balloon is going to become very, very small. So between the air that you are breathing in and out normally, you have added another component here. And so this, whatever you had between here is tidal breathing. What you have taken in here is over and above the tidal breathing. That means at the end of inspiration here, At the end of inspiration, remember, you are inspiring 500 mLs and you have reached that point, you're 500. Then you expire, remove 500, you go back here. Inspire 500, go there. Expire 500. And then at this point, I tell you now, breathe in as much as you can. So you'll breathe in what you are normally breathing. And on top of that, you'll breathe in as much air as your lungs can hold. It will reach a peak. And then if I tell you to breathe out and go back to your normal breathing, now it means at this level, this is the maximum air you can inhale. Now, this is what you call the inspiratory volume. Whatever you are taking in, you have the tidal volume and you have a reserve volume. The reserve volume is up and above what you normally take. Reserve means above the normal. The normal is tidal. Above the normal will be reserve. So now, after you get that, there is that component of what capacity can you hold in air. The capacity of air that you can hold in your lungs is, after inspiration, there is the tidal volume, and then there is the inspiratory reserve volume. Two of them, if you add these two together, it means after expiration, after breathing out, the amount of air that you can maximally hold will comprise the tidal volume plus the reserve volume. Those two together are referred to as the inspiratory capacity here. You have this component. Remember, inspiration, taking in, and the capacity takes into account more than one volume. In this case, one volume is tidal volume, and the other volume is the inspiratory reserve. So when the two of them are added together, they give you the capability of holding that air after inspiration, which is the inspiratory capacity. Now, on the other hand, if you are to breathe normally, and then at the end of expiration, after you breathe out, I ask you to forcefully remove all the air that you can. Now you recruit all your muscles, you contract and you push against your walls, and you push out as much air as you can. That is referred to as the reserve volume for expiration. So expiratory reserve volume is over and above the tidal volume, the amount of air you can remove over and above the tidal volume. So when you add this to, or before I get my capacity here, I want to ask you a question. If I breathe out as much air and I use all my muscles to push out all the air from my lungs, is there any air that remains within the lungs?
Yes. Yes.
You think there is some air that remains within the lungs? Where is it? Where will that air be? Who has an idea? At least you have an idea. How many think there will still be air remaining in the lungs? So you all know there is some air that remains in the lungs, but how many have a clue where the air is? If you have a clue where the air is, within your lungs? So yes, tell us.
I think some of it still remains in the alveolus.
Some will be in the alveolus. Eden.
Yeah, I will go with yes.
Okay, Sebata.
Yeah, I was going for the same thing actually.
Okay, so most of you think they are in the alveoli.
Yes.
So yes, I will not dispute you have some air in the lungs, and we'll come to later. We'll find out why all the air does not leave the alveolus. However, remember, from your mouth, remember you have what? The trachea, isn't it? And then you have the bronchi. And then you have, from the bronchi, branches into a respiratory tree in the bronchioles, and this will be the lung. Similarly on this side. So now, when you compress the lungs as much as you can, you are using your muscles to pressurize. The one thing you can be sure, you never flatten the lungs. They do not flatten. It's like taking a balloon and rolling it out so that you squeeze out all the air. It doesn't happen that way. Even a balloon, if you blow up the balloon and then you release it and don't push it down, if you just release it on a table, you'll find that it will release air, but it will still be bulging slightly. So I believe that's what your colleagues were saying. Some air remains in the alveoli. However, remember that even the airways here, these airways do not collapse. They do not flatten. As such, we also have air within the airways. So the remaining air will be trapped within the alveoli, and some of it will be trapped within the airways. So it doesn't get out. Not all of it gets out. Now that amount of air, after forcefully trying to remove everything you can, what remains here is what we call the residual volume. This residual volume, you cannot get it out. Even if you try to squeeze it out, you cannot. So it always remains there. However, remember we have a reserve volume here. You have your normal breathing in and out, and after a normal exhalation, you still have the ability to forcefully remove more air. If I add that reserve volume to the residual volume, I get another capacity. Remember, a capacity is a sum of more than one volume. In this case, it is called the functional residual capacity. It is taking into account the air in the airways and the air in the alveoli, plus the reserve volume. Okay, so that captures the functional residual capacity. Are those two clear? I will start calling people randomly. It's afternoon, people sleep. There's someone with a question? Or am I seeing whose hand is this up? Okay. So you are clear on that?
Yes.
All right. So we have so far discussed tidal volume as one volume, inspiratory reserve volume. So let's give it numbers. This is number 1. This is number 2. The inspiratory reserve volume. And then number 3 was the expiratory reserve volume. Now, the next volume I want us to check is the residual volume. So when you're discussing, always remember 4 volumes. What you quiet breathing gives you a tidal volume. Over and above the tidal volume is the inspiratory reserve volume. Over and above The expiratory volume is the expiratory reserve volume. And then what remains in the lungs even after you expire is the residual volume. So always remember 4 volumes. The next thing I want you to take into account is the capacities. How many capacities do we have? We said a capacity is the sum of more than one volume. And the first one we described is, I'll put it in red, inspiratory capacity. And then we have the functional residual capacity. I want to introduce the third type of capacity. Now, if I were to ask you to breathe normally, and then after the last expiration, I tell you to take a deep breath as fast as you can, as much as you can, till you feel that your chest is bursting. That volume you take in will reach that maximum volume. And then from there, I tell you, now I want you to remove all the air from your lungs so that what remains is only the residual volume. That will have taken into account all the air that is capable of moving in and out of your lungs. So the one that is capable of moving into your lungs is the inspiratory capacity. The one that is capable of getting out of your lungs is the expiratory reserve volume. So if you add the expiratory reserve volume to the inspiratory capacity, you're going to get a vital capacity. Vital capacity represents all the air that is capable of getting in and out of your lungs after a maximum inhalation followed by a maximum exhalation. Vital capacity. Now, the next one I want you to take into consideration is that when you take the maximum inspiration, it did not start from 0. Remember, it started from the residual volume that normally remains in your lungs, and then you took in your vital capacity. All the air in your lungs that you are holding after a maximum inhalation is a sum of vital capacity and residual volume, and that is known as the total lung capacity. So we have the 4 volumes and now 4 capacities. Okay, 4 volumes, 4 capacities. So when you go and do your spirometry, these are the volumes that you're going to first look for. So you find that the amount of air that you can take into your lungs will be determined by so many components. 1, how fit are you? So that if you look at somebody who is very athletic, they're always running, they're always doing exercises, so they have learned to breathe in and exhale. They have developed a lot of elasticity in their lungs. You find that the volume, the total lung capacity is usually large as compared to somebody who is very docile. They hardly expand their lungs, so they do not need to expand. So if you look at the lifestyle of somebody, it will determine these lung volumes. So the larger the volumes is for the more fit or more athletic people. Number 2, the gender. You find that with males, they usually have bigger capacities as compared to the female. So the other thing you have to also consider that will determine the amount of volume breathed in or exhaled is the health condition or the health status of the person. Are their lungs restricted? Are their airways obstructed? Do they have compliance within the lungs? The lung tissue, is it elastic enough to be inflated? So all those things will also determine the amount of air that you take in. There is also another component that is also very important. Remember, when we talk of elasticity, it means the extensibility. How far are you able to stretch it without breaking, without causing damage? So if you are able to extend a small balloon into a very large balloon without causing damage, then that balloon, the material is very elastic. However, you can have elasticity without recoil. That means, take for example, if you have a chewing gum and you chew and chew and chew that gum, if you stretch it, it will become very long and it won't be damaged. That means it is very elastic. However, after you stretch it and you release it, does it go back to its original size? A chewing gum, after you stretch, you've done this. I think every child in primary school has done this. You chew your chewing gum and then you pull it out. Does it go back into the mouth?
No.
Only Eden has eaten a chewing gum. You want me to bring them in class next time? How many people are in class?
No, it doesn't go back.
Yeah, here.
Yeah.
So do I start calling people? Anyway, I don't have time for that. If you are not listening, I have to allow the class to go to the next class, your next lecture. So anyway, it doesn't go back. It means that this chewing gum has no recoil. That's the difference between elasticity and recoil. Recoil is like behaving like a spring. When you have a spring and you stretch out a spring, and then you release the spring, it goes back to its original size. That is recoil. So when you have lungs that can expand, and then they cannot recoil, it means after exhalation, the lung is still large. And therefore, if you try to inhale again, you can only inhale a very little amount of air because there was no recoil. However, if there was recoil and it is elastic and you inhale, you have the difference of all this air. So imagine if you had recoiled it. After the recoil, this is the volume of the lung. Then you try to inhale a second time, the volume of air inhaled after first inhalation will only be this much, as compared to this one when there is recoil. So this is another thing that you normally test when you're looking for those lung conditions. So for example, like we said, when you have emphysema, you tear down the walls and you find that these lungs, even after exhalation, they do not go back to their normal size. And we'll see the graphs that are represented in such conditions. So now, what do we measure when we are looking at spirometry? Number one, what you are able to measure is the amount of air that can move in and out of your lungs. That means you cannot measure this one. If you cannot measure the residual volume, you cannot measure total lung capacity, because total lung capacity takes into account residual volume. Neither can you measure the functional residual capacity, because even that one takes into account the residual volume. So when you are doing spirometry, you cannot measure residual volume, you cannot measure functional residual capacity, and you cannot measure the total lung capacity for the simple reason that you are not able to get this value. So for you to measure residual capacity, you are going to see in those videos that I will post, there are special tests that are carried out. And those tests are the ones which can determine the residual volume. So it is not spirometry. Spirometry only measures what you can go into the lungs and what can leave the lungs. So it can measure vital capacity, which is VC, and it can also measure what we call forced vital capacity. So it will measure vital capacity and it will measure forced vital capacity. So somebody may ask, what's the difference between these two? So you remember at the beginning of the lecture, I told you, you can be doing static measurements versus dynamic measurements. When you are looking at VC, it is not taking into account time. If it's not taking into account time, then it is just a normal vital capacity. If it takes into account as fast as you can, you are forcing air out within a very short period of time, then it is forced vital capacity. It can also measure FEV1, and I think because I'm running out of time, I normally like taking my pre-lab for 1 hour. So what I will do is next time I will discuss the forced expiratory volume in the first 1 second. FEV1, forced expiratory volume in the first 1 second. Then you're going to compare. Remember, FVC is vital capacity at the shortest period of time. FVC. So when we look at how much air can you forcefully remove within the first 1 second, and you compare it to how much air you can forcefully remove from your lungs after maximum inhalation, it gives you a ratio. And this ratio can determine how effective or how good your lungs are working. So the other thing you measure is volume against time. So you can look at volume, how much volume goes in within a given period of time, and it will give you a given graph. So that is the flow volume, or rather time volume chart. Against another one we are going to look at the flow volume chart. So these parameters, I think I will discuss them when I have more time. So I think with that, those parameters are going to show you all these graphs. And this is what you'll be measuring. So I'll touch on them a bit in class so that when you go to the lab, you have an idea of what you're doing. Questions so far before I release you? Any question?
Question, please.
Yes.
Go
ahead.
Whether the tidal volume is the same as quiet volume.
Yes. Quiet breathing gives you a tidal volume. The tide comes from, if you've been to the beach, at the ocean, you usually have waves coming in and then going back, coming in and going back. And they go in there, it's like a tide. It comes in and then it ebbs to and fro. That is where the name tidal comes from. It just slowly goes in and out. And during this period of time, you do not force air. It is quiet breathing. So during quiet breathing, the volumes you measure is tidal breathing. Okay. Any other question before I leave? Let me take attendance now. What do they want to do? Yeah.